I came back from war. And my wife asked, "How are you home already?" I dropped my duffel bag on the porch, confused. "What do you mean? My deployment ended." She stumbled backward and grabbed the doorframe. "Daddy!" My 6-year-old son Tommy came running and wrapped himself around my legs. "You're alive! You're alive! Mommy said you died!" The words hit me like a punch. I looked at Ursula for an explanation, but she just stood there frozen, tears streaming down her face. "I need to sit down." Ursula's face crumpled. "Tommy, please go to your room." "But I want to tell Daddy about— Now!" I headed upstairs to check on him and past our bedroom. Something told me to push the door open and my heart stopped. There was a man I didn't recognize in my bed. "Who is that?" My voice came out cold. She looked up with red, puffy eyes. "His name is Stephen." Before I could say anything else, there were footsteps behind me. It was Stephen. He saw me in my uniform and froze. "Wait, you're alive?" He turned to Ursula. "Ursula, what the hell is going on?" She wouldn't look at either of us. "You showed me the obituary." "I went to the funeral." That's when I realized he didn't know. "How long have you been here?" I asked him directly. 8 months. She called me in April, said you'd been killed. Stephen was pacing now. "I quit my job in Denver for this. I had a promotion coming up, everything." "You quit your job?" Stephen turned to face Ursula. "You said Tommy needed stability," Stephen said, looking at Ursula. "I used my savings to pay for his therapy sessions. You said the military insurance wouldn't cover it." He pulled out his phone and showed me. $6,000 in therapy payments over 8 months. My eyes were fixed on the ring on her finger, one I didn't recognize. "She told me we'd get married," Stephen announced, following my gaze. "After enough time passed. She said Tommy was already calling me Dad and it would help him." I turned to Ursula. "He calls him Dad?" She was crying, but I didn't care anymore. "My brother died in Iraq 5 years ago," Stephen said. "When Ursula told me you'd been killed and she needed help, I thought it was what he would have wanted. You put our son in grief therapy," I said to Ursula. "You made him think his dad was dead. You made a 6-year-old mourn me for no reason." "I watched my best friend die in March," I continued. "He took a bullet meant for me. Last thing he said was, 'Tell your family you love them.' That's what kept me alive." I had to grab the table. "I sent love letters every week, telling you how much I missed you, telling Tommy about where I was." Stephen's jaw clenched. "You were reading his letters while I was sleeping in his bed?" "Did you close our accounts?" I asked, pulling out my phone. "I tried to buy coffee at the airport and my card declined. I have $3,000 cash and no way to access anything because you declared me dead while I was still overseas." Stephen stood up fast. "Where's the insurance money?" Ursula went very still. "What insurance money?" "The life insurance. $400,000. We filed in May. You said it was going into a trust for Tommy's college." I pulled out my phone and logged into our bank account. There it was, dozens of cash withdrawals following the insurance payout, all from an ATM by the casino downtown. "She has a gambling problem," I said flatly. Ursula was sobbing now. "I was going to pay it back. I was going to—" "I thought I was honoring you," Stephen said to me. "Every time I helped with homework, every parent-teacher conference, I kept thinking, this is what his dad would want." Ursula tried to stand. "I can explain—" "Explain what?" Stephen's voice was sharp. "Get out," I told Ursula. "This is my house too. You declared me dead. But Stephen's a witness. We both are." Tommy came down the stairs. "Why is everyone yelling?" Ursula moved toward him, but he stepped back. "Why did you say Daddy was dead?" "Baby, I can explain. Was it all a lie?" Tommy looked between us. Stephen knelt down. "Tommy, your dad's been alive the whole time. He never left you." Tommy ran to me and I picked him up. "I thought you were dead. I thought you left me. I never stopped being your daddy." Stephen was still on the phone. "Yes, military life insurance fraud. Service member identity fraud." He looked at me. Ursula grabbed her purse. "Where am I supposed to go?" "Not my problem. You figured it out for 8 months while I was getting shot at." Behind me, Stephen was already on the phone to her father, an ex-veteran. I heard forensic accountant. 8 months, her dad repeated. "And Ursula? You better not be there when I arrive." He hung up the phone, and when I turned to Ursula, she was looking at me with something that said she was willing to do anything but leave peacefully. Her hand moved fast to the kitchen counter and grabbed the big knife we used for cutting meat. Stephen jumped between her and Tommy while I pushed my son behind me. She was backing toward the door, waving the knife back and forth in front of her like she was trying to keep us all away. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. I told the operator my wife had a knife and was threatening us at our address. When Ursula heard me say our street number, she dropped the knife on the floor and ran out the front door. The knife clattered on the tile and Tommy pressed harder against my back. Stephen picked up the knife and put it in the sink while we waited for the police. 2 cop cars pulled up within 5 minutes with their lights flashing. The officers came in and I showed them the knife while Stephen told them what happened. They took our statements one by one and wrote everything down in their notebooks. The female officer told me they were issuing a protective order right away. She said Ursula couldn't come within 500 feet of the house or she'd be arrested. They gave me paperwork to sign and said they'd try to find her. Tommy wouldn't let go of my hand the rest of the day. He kept asking why Mommy had the knife and if she was going to hurt us. I told him Mommy was sick and needed help from doctors to get better. We ate dinner on the couch watching cartoons because Tommy didn't want to sit at the kitchen table. He fell asleep holding onto my arm and I carried him to my bed. Every time I tried to move away, he'd grab me tighter and whimper in his sleep. I stayed awake most of the night watching him breathe and checking the locks on the doors. The next morning I called the bank while Tommy was still sleeping. The woman on the phone said my accounts were frozen because of the death certificate filed with them. She told me I needed official corrections from the state before they could give me access again. The process would take at least 3 weeks, maybe longer with all the paperwork involved. I only had the cash in my wallet to live on until then. Stephen knocked on the door around 10 with coffee in his laptop bag. He said he wanted to help document everything for the police report we'd need to file. We sat at the dining room table going through emails and bank statements from the past 8 months. He showed me receipts for all the therapy sessions he'd paid for Tommy in cash, every week for 8 months, thinking he was helping a kid who'd lost his dad. I called my unit's administrative office and explained the situation to the sergeant who answered. He couldn't believe what he was hearing and had to get his commanding officer on the line. They promised to expedite the paperwork, but warned me the military bureaucracy would still take time. That afternoon, I heard a car pull up and saw Ursula's father getting out with a woman carrying a briefcase. He walked up and hugged me tight, then pulled back and said he was sorry for what his daughter had done. The woman was Marilyn Foster, a forensic accountant he'd hired to go through all the financial records. She spread papers across the dining table and started making notes about every transaction since I'd deployed. Ursula's father kept shaking his head as she pointed out withdrawal after withdrawal from the casino ATM. The school called my cell phone around 2 o'clock that afternoon. The principal said Ursula had shown up trying to sign Tommy out for a doctor's appointment. She'd kept Tommy in the office when something seemed wrong and called the police instead of releasing him. The officers arrested Ursula right there in the school lobby for violating the protective order from last night. Tommy was safe but scared, and they wanted me to come pick him up early. Stephen drove me to the school while Ursula's father stayed with Marilyn to keep working. That evening, a detective knocked on our door and introduced himself as Earl Sutton. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and the straight-back posture of someone who'd served. He shook my hand and said he'd been assigned to our case because of the military fraud angle. He sat at our kitchen table taking notes while I walked him through everything from the beginning. He asked detailed questions about dates and documents, writing everything down in a small notebook. When I showed him the bank statements with all the casino withdrawals, his jaw tightened. He said this was one of the worst cases of military insurance fraud he'd seen. He promised he'd make sure the investigation was thorough and that Ursula would face federal charges. Stephen stayed to talk to him too, explaining how Ursula had convinced him I was dead. The next morning, I drove to the JAG office on base while Tommy was at the school. Catherine Meeks was waiting for me in a small conference room with a stack of forms already printed out. She'd seen cases like mine before, soldiers declared dead while they were still deployed, though usually not by their own wives. She walked me through the DEERS system, showing me on her computer how my status still said deceased in the military database. She typed quickly, filling out correction forms while explaining each step. The whole process would take weeks to fix completely, but she could start the emergency corrections right away. She gave me a temporary letter stating I was alive and serving, which would help with other agencies. That afternoon, Stephen showed up at the house carrying 3 cardboard boxes. He set them on the kitchen table and opened the first one, pulling out receipt after receipt. Every single therapy session for Tommy, paid in cash because Ursula told him the military insurance wouldn't process claims for a dead soldier's family. $6,000 total, all from his savings account that he'd been building for years. He showed me the withdrawal slips from his bank, dated right after he moved here from Denver. The receipts had the therapist's signature, Anahi Ramos, and notes about Tommy's grief counseling sessions. Stephen had kept everything organized in folders by month, thinking someday it might help with taxes or insurance. While we were going through the receipts, Marilyn Foster called from Ursula's father's house. She'd been digging through the insurance paperwork all morning and found something important. The death certificate Ursula used for the insurance claim was notarized at a check cashing place downtown, not at any official government office. She'd already driven there and talked to the owner, who remembered Ursula coming in with the document. The signature on the death certificate didn't match any of my unit's commanding officers, just some made-up name that didn't exist in military records. Marilyn was scanning everything to send to Detective Sutton and the insurance company. My phone buzzed with an email from Tommy's teacher while I was making lunch. She'd written 3 pages about how Tommy had changed over the past 8 months. She described him going from a happy kid who loved recess to someone who sat alone at lunch and cried during story time. She mentioned all the parent-teacher conferences where Stephen showed up instead of Ursula, how he asked questions about helping Tommy cope with loss. The teacher had even suggested grief support groups, which Stephen had looked into. She attached Tommy's drawings from art class, pictures of soldiers and graves and dark clouds. The funeral home director called while I was reading the email. His voice sounded uncomfortable as he explained the situation. Ursula had paid him $8,000 cash for a memorial service back in April. She'd ordered the works, including an empty casket, printed programs with my photo and flowers. He still had copies of everything in his files because something had seemed strange about the whole thing. She'd insisted on a closed casket even though there was no body, said it was for closure. He'd held the service on a Tuesday morning with about 20 people attending, mostly Ursula's friends. He was faxing the invoice and guest list to Detective Sutton's office. The next morning I had to go to the DMV to get my license renewed since mine had expired while deployed. The clerk looked at her screen and frowned, saying I was listed as deceased in their system. She didn't know what to do, and had to call her supervisor, who had to call their supervisor. They made me fill out form after form, each one requiring proof I was actually alive. I showed them Catherine Meek's letter, my military ID, my passport, everything I had. 3 hours later, they finally gave me a temporary paper license while they processed the correction. The whole time other people in line were staring at me like I was some kind of zombie. That evening, my phone rang with a blocked number. It was Zachariah Collier from the insurance company's fraud investigation unit. He'd already pulled Ursula's entire claim file and found problems everywhere. The claim was processed way too fast, without proper verification of military records. Someone at their company had rubber-stamped it without following protocol. He was reviewing every document, finding forged signatures and fake forms throughout. He said they'd be pursuing criminal charges and would need my full cooperation. He was sending an investigator to meet with me in person next week. Later that night, after Tommy was in bed, Stephen and I sat on the back porch. He started talking about his brother who died in Iraq 5 years ago. His voice got quiet as he explained how Ursula's call had hit him hard, bringing back all those memories. When she said a soldier's widow needed help, he couldn't say no. His brother had left behind a wife and 2 kids, and Stephen had watched them struggle. He thought helping us was what his brother would have wanted. His voice cracked when he admitted he really thought he was doing something good, something honorable. He'd given up everything to be here because he believed in helping a military family. 2 days later, Detective Sutton called saying he'd gotten the casino surveillance footage. He wanted us to come to the station to see it. We sat in a small viewing room while he played clip after clip on his computer. There was Ursula at the ATM, taking out the maximum withdrawal over and over. The timestamps matched perfectly with the insurance payout hitting her account. She'd withdrawn $40,000 in cash in just 3 days, all from that same ATM next to the casino entrance. The footage also showed her going straight from the ATM into the casino each time. Detective Sutton had even gotten footage from inside showing her at the slot machines and poker tables. That night at dinner, Tommy looked at Stephen and asked if he was leaving too. Stephen and I exchanged glances, neither of us sure what to say. Tommy's eyes were wide and scared, and I realized my son had already lost his mom and thought he'd lost me, and now he might lose Stephen too. Stephen put down his fork and looked Tommy straight in the eyes, promising he would stay until everything was sorted out. He said he wasn't going anywhere until Tommy felt safe and things were back to normal. Tommy nodded and went back to eating, but I saw him relax for the first time in days. 3 days later, the bank finally called about my account, and the woman on the phone said they could unfreeze one checking account with just $2,000 in it, but at least I could buy groceries without using my cash stash. I drove straight to the ATM and pulled out $100 just to make sure the card actually worked and felt stupid getting excited about accessing my own money. But after weeks of being financially dead, it felt like a small victory. That afternoon, while Stephen was playing with Tommy in the backyard, my phone rang, and it was Anahi Ramos, who had been Tommy's grief therapist for the past 8 months. She sounded uncomfortable, explaining that she had an ethical problem continuing treatment since the whole basis of therapy was false, and she needed to file reports with the state licensing board about the situation. She gave me the name of a new therapist who specialized in trauma from parental deception and said she'd already sent over Tommy's files with a detailed explanation of what had happened. I thanked her and wrote down the new therapist's number while watching Tommy and Stephen throwing a football outside. The next morning, I got another unexpected call from a woman who said she was Ursula's gambling addiction counselor, and normally she couldn't break confidentiality, but given the criminal case, she felt obligated to tell me something important. She explained that Ursula had been in treatment for compulsive gambling for 3 months before my deployment, but stopped coming to sessions right after the insurance payout hit her account in May. The counselor had records showing Ursula talked about her gambling debts and even mentioned considering faking my death for the insurance money during a session, but the counselor thought it was just desperate talk, not an actual plan. I asked her to send everything to Detective Sutton, and she agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. 2 days later, I met with Catherine Meeks at the JAG office to file for emergency temporary custody, and she helped me fill out all the paperwork while explaining the process. The hearing was set for next week, and we spent 3 hours preparing evidence, including the fraud documentation and Tommy's therapy records, showing the psychological damage from the false grief. Catherine said the judge would likely be sympathetic given the circumstances, but warned me to stay calm and factual during the hearing, no matter what Ursula's lawyer tried to argue. That evening after dinner, someone knocked hard on the front door, and when I opened it, There was a big guy in a leather jacket asking for Ursula. He said she owed $30,000 to his boss, and the payment was overdue, and he'd been to her parents' house, but they said to try here. Stephen came up behind me, and we both told the guy Ursula didn't live here anymore, and he needed to leave our property immediately. The guy looked at us and said his boss didn't care about our domestic problems, and someone better pay up soon. Then he walked back to his car and drove off slowly, like he was memorizing the house. I called Detective Sutton right away and told him about the loan shark's collector showing up, and he said this was getting more dangerous than just fraud. He came by the next morning with a security company rep and suggested installing cameras on all corners of the house, plus changing every lock since Ursula still had keys. The security guy walked around taking measurements and said he could have everything installed by tomorrow, and Detective Sutton mentioned Ursula might get desperate as her options ran out and the walls closed in. He advised keeping Tommy away from windows and varying our daily routines, so nobody could predict when we'd be home or gone. The next week, I spent an entire morning at the Social Security office trying to resurrect my official records, and the clerk behind the counter actually laughed when she saw my file. She made a dark joke about me being the first zombie she'd ever processed, but then got serious when she saw how much paperwork was required. Form after form needed to be filled out to officially bring me back from the dead in their system, and each one required multiple proofs of identity and notarized statements. She said the whole process would take at least 6 weeks, and gave me a thick packet of additional forms to complete at home. That afternoon, Stephen's phone rang, and it was his former employer in Denver offering him his old job back with the promotion he'd missed, but he had to return immediately to accept it. He looked torn as he told me about the offer, and kept glancing at Tommy, who was doing homework at the kitchen table. Stephen said he wanted to help us through this mess, but he also needed to think about his own future and rebuilding his savings after spending everything on what he thought was helping a widow and her son. We talked about it that night after Tommy went to bed, and Stephen decided to ask for 2 more weeks before starting so he could at least get through the custody hearing and make sure we were safe. The company agreed but made it clear this was his only chance to come back. A few nights later, Tommy woke up screaming about coffins, and I found him sobbing in his bed saying he dreamed I was in a box underground and couldn't get out. This was the 3rd nightmare that week, and when I took him to the new therapist, she explained it would take months to undo the psychological damage of grieving a living parent. She said Tommy's brain had processed my death as real trauma, and even though he knew I was alive now, his subconscious was still working through the false memories of loss. The therapist recommended keeping his routine stable and being patient when the nightmares happened, since forcing him to get over it would only make things worse. Meanwhile, Marilyn Foster had been digging through financial records and called to say she'd found something worse than the gambling. Ursula had opened 4 credit cards in my name while I was deployed and maxed them all out for a total of $40,000 on top of what she'd gambled away. Marilyn had copies of the applications showing my forged signature, and the cards were all sent to a P.O. box Ursula rented just for this purpose. The debt was already in collections and destroying my credit score, even though I'd never seen these cards or made any of the purchases. The custody hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday, and Catherine helped me prepare a thick folder of evidence, including the forged death certificate, bank statements showing the gambling withdrawals, and Stephen's receipts for all the therapy he'd paid for. Walking into that courtroom felt surreal, because just 2 weeks ago, I'd been dodging bullets overseas, and now I was fighting for my son in a different kind of war. The judge was an older woman who'd served in the Navy, and when she saw my uniform, her face got serious real fast. Catherine presented everything methodically, while Ursula's court-appointed lawyer tried to argue that she'd been under extreme stress and made poor choices but never intended harm. The judge flipped through the evidence, and I saw her jaw tighten when she reached the therapy notes describing Tommy's nightmares about his dead father. She asked Ursula directly if she'd told her 6-year-old son that his father had died, and Ursula just nodded while crying. The judge didn't even need to deliberate and granted me temporary sole custody, with Ursula getting supervised visitation twice a week pending the criminal case. 2 days after the hearing, Ursula's public defender called my cell while I was making Tommy breakfast. He said Ursula would plead guilty to the fraud charges if I'd support probation instead of prison time because Tommy needed his mother, even if she'd made mistakes. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly I was too angry to even consider it right then. That same afternoon, I was driving past the pawn shops on Maple Street when something made me pull over and check them out. The 3rd shop I walked into had our wedding ring sitting right there in the display case, with a yellow tag showing it had been there for 3 months. The owner remembered Ursula bringing it in because she'd been crying and desperate for quick cash, and he'd given her $800 for a ring that cost me $4,000. I bought it back for $1,200 and stuck it in my pocket, not really sure what I was going to do with it. Stephen had been staying at the Motel 6 down the road, but he came by every day after work to help with Tommy's homework and all the paperwork that kept piling up. He told me he'd extended his return to Denver by another month so he could testify if the case went to trial, and his old company was holding his job but getting impatient. We developed this weird routine where he'd show up around 5 with takeout, and we'd eat together while Tommy told us about school. Then Stephen would help him with math while I dealt with phone calls and forms. The insurance company sent a formal demand letter requiring full restitution of the $400,000, and Zachariah called to explain they were pursuing criminal charges, regardless of what I wanted, because fraud of this magnitude couldn't be ignored. He said they'd already filed with the federal prosecutor since it involved military benefits, and the FBI might get involved, which made everything feel even more overwhelming. Tommy's teacher called asking for a meeting, and when I went in, she said the school counselor recommended keeping his routine as stable as possible, despite everything happening at home. She offered to give him extra help during lunch, and said she'd noticed him starting to participate more in class activities after weeks of being withdrawn. She had this gentle way of talking about it that made me realize how many people were trying to help us get through this mess. Detective Sutton called saying he needed to interview the notary who'd signed the death certificate and asked if I wanted to be there when he questioned him. We met at the police station where this nervous guy in his 50s admitted Ursula had paid him $500 cash to notarize the document without proper verification from the military. He kept saying he thought it was legitimate because she was crying and had other paperwork, but Detective Sutton just took notes and said falsifying government documents was a felony. My military pay finally got reinstated, but Catherine warned the 3 months of back pay was tied up in processing and could take another month to actually hit my account. She filed expedite requests with 3 different offices, but said the system moved at its own pace regardless of personal emergencies. In the meantime, I was living off the $2,000 from my unfrozen account and the cash I'd brought home, which was running low fast with all the legal fees and daily expenses. Ursula's father asked me to meet him and Marilyn at her office to discuss the financial recovery plan, and when I got there, they had spreadsheets showing every debt and fraudulent charge. Even with full restitution from Ursula, which we'd probably never see, it would take years to restore my credit score and pay off the $40,000 in credit card debt she'd racked up in my name. Marilyn said we could dispute the charges, but it was a long process, and creditors would still come after me in the meantime. That night after Tommy was asleep, Stephen and I were sitting on the porch and things got awkward when he pulled out his phone to show me something. He had dozens of videos from the past 8 months, including Tommy's 7th birthday party, which happened while I was deployed. In the videos, Tommy was blowing out candles and calling Stephen Dad, and opening presents I'd never seen. Stephen kept apologizing, saying he thought he was doing the right thing, but watching my son call another man Dad while I was getting shot at overseas made me have to walk away for a minute. When I came back, Stephen was putting his phone away and looking at the ground. The next morning, Detective Sutton called saying the district attorney was taking over the case since military insurance fraud made it federal, and that meant Ursula could face up to 20 years if convicted. He needed me at the courthouse next week to testify before the grand jury and warned me to bring all my deployment papers and copies of the insurance documents. I spent 3 days organizing everything into folders while Tommy was at the school, and Stephen helped by making copies at the library, since I didn't have a working printer yet. The grand jury room was smaller than I expected, with just 23 people sitting in rows looking at me while the prosecutor asked questions for 2 hours about the timeline and showing them the forged death certificate and bank records. The prosecutor pulled me aside afterwards, saying they were confident about indictment, but warned that Ursula might take a plea deal to avoid trial, which could mean less prison time, but guaranteed conviction. That same week, Tommy's new therapist called me in to look at pictures he'd been drawing during sessions, showing 2 stick figures labeled Daddy and Uncle Steve, standing next to a smaller figure that was him. She explained Tommy was processing the confusion of having 2 father figures, and that it was actually healthy he could distinguish between them now, instead of the mixed-up grief he'd been carrying. Tommy asked her if it was okay to like both of us, and she helped him understand that Stephen was tricked too, and that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes that hurt kids without meaning to. The supervised visitation happened that Saturday at the courthouse family room, with a social worker watching everything and taking notes. Ursula spent the whole hour trying to tell Tommy she was the victim and that Daddy was being mean to Mommy, and the supervisor stopped the visit after 40 minutes when Tommy started crying. The supervisor wrote in her report that Ursula showed no accountability and was attempting emotional manipulation of the child, which would be filed with the court immediately. 3 days later, my back pay finally hit my account, $12,000 that let me hire a civil attorney who specialized in fraud cases and identity theft. He said we could sue for damages beyond just the stolen money, including emotional distress for Tommy, and the costs of therapy and credit repair, which could triple the amount. Stephen called me that afternoon saying a company downtown offered him a project manager position after seeing his Denver experience on his resume. He wanted to stay in town and asked if I'd be okay with him being part of Tommy's life like an uncle, since Tommy had gotten attached to him over those 8 months. I told him I'd think about it, but honestly I was already seeing how Tommy smiled when Stephen picked him up from the school twice a week while I was dealing with lawyers. 2 weeks later, the grand jury indicted Ursula on 14 counts, including wire fraud, identity theft, forgery, insurance fraud, and theft of government property. Her father called me that night saying he was done paying for her lawyer after seeing the evidence, and that she needed to face the consequences of what she'd done. The federal public defender would take over her case, but everyone knew they were overwhelmed and wouldn't fight as hard as a private attorney would. Monday morning, I went back to work at the base for the first time since returning from deployment, and everyone already knew the story from base gossip. Some guys from my unit offered to help with anything I needed, while others kept their distance like they didn't know what to say to someone whose wife faked their death. My sergeant pulled me aside and said to take whatever time I needed for court dates and lawyer meetings, and that the unit had my back through all of this. Tommy's teacher sent home a note that Thursday, saying he'd had his first good week without any crying episodes or angry outbursts. She wrote that he actually laughed during recess when playing kickball and was participating in group reading for the first time in months, which felt like actual progress. That Friday afternoon, Ursula's public defender called about a plea negotiation where she'd admit to some charges in exchange for dropping others and recommend 5 years instead of 20. The prosecutor called me an hour later saying the negotiation fell apart because Ursula refused to admit full guilt and kept insisting she was going to pay it back eventually. They decided to take it to trial, which meant a longer process, but also meant Tommy might have to testify about what his mom told him when she said I was dead. I spent that night on the couch looking at deployment photos on my phone and thinking about how different everything was supposed to be when I came home. The next morning, Catherine Meeks called early and told me to come to the JAG office right away because she'd gotten through to someone at the federal level who could fix my records. I drove there still half asleep and spent 4 hours signing papers while she worked on 3 different computers at once, calling various offices and using military codes I didn't understand. She pulled up screen after screen showing my status changing from deceased back to active duty, each system update taking forever to process, while she explained that credit bureaus would be a whole other battle that could take years. By lunch, she had most of it sorted, but warned me that random systems would still show me as dead for months, which meant I'd have to carry documentation everywhere proving I was alive. 3 days later, Stephen called asking if I'd be okay with him taking Tommy to a baseball game that Saturday, since he'd already bought tickets months ago when they thought I was dead. I met them at the stadium, and Tommy was wearing the jersey Stephen had gotten him, looking confused about whether it was okay to be excited with both of us there. We sat through 9 innings barely talking, except when Tommy asked if we were friends now, and Stephen looked at me before saying we were complicated friends, which actually made me laugh for the first time since getting back. The forensic accountant Marilyn testified in a deposition the next week, laying out spreadsheets showing how Ursula had opened new accounts 2 months before my deployment and started moving money around in patterns that showed clear planning. She pointed to specific dates where Ursula had researched life insurance policies and military death benefits, even bookmarking articles about how to file claims, all time-stamped before I'd even gotten my deployment orders. The prosecutor took notes while Marilyn explained how this destroyed any chance of Ursula claiming desperation or a sudden mistake, since the evidence showed methodical preparation over weeks. That same afternoon, I got a call from a woman saying she was Ursula's mother and that she'd been estranged from her daughter for 6 years, but heard about the case from a cousin. She told me about Ursula's gambling starting in college, the lies about tuition money, the stolen credit cards, and how she'd cut contact after Ursula had forged her signature on a home equity loan. She offered to testify about the pattern of behavior if it would help protect Tommy, saying she'd been waiting for this call for years, knowing her daughter would eventually destroy someone's life. Detective Sutton came by the house 2 days later with boxes of evidence they'd collected, showing me photos of the casino surveillance, the forged documents, and witness statements from everyone involved. He said between the insurance fraud, the identity theft, the forgery, and the child abuse charges for traumatizing Tommy, they had enough for 20 years if a jury convicted on everything. He seemed satisfied, but I just felt empty, looking at all that evidence of how thoroughly she'd planned to erase me from existence. My lawyer called that Thursday saying the trial date was set for 6 weeks out and explaining that the prosecutor had decided Tommy wouldn't need to testify since they had so much physical evidence and adult witnesses. He walked me through what to expect, how long it might take, and warned me that Ursula's public defender would probably push for a plea deal once they saw the mountain of evidence against her. The next week, I got invited to a support group meeting on base for military families dealing with fraud and identity theft, which turned out to be more common than I'd thought. 8 other people sat in that conference room sharing stories about spouses who'd emptied accounts, sold houses, or declared them dead while deployed, and we started meeting every Tuesday to share resources and warning signs. One guy had been through something almost identical 3 years earlier and gave me his lawyer's number plus tips on rebuilding credit after identity theft. Stephen signed a lease on an apartment across town and asked if he could establish a regular schedule with Tommy since they'd gotten so attached during those 8 months. We worked out Wednesday dinners and Saturday afternoons, which Tommy seemed happy about even though he still looked confused sometimes about why Stephen wasn't living with us anymore. I watched them leave together that first Wednesday, and Tommy was chattering about school while Stephen listened like he always had, and I realized this weird arrangement might actually work. I went back to the pawn shop where the owner remembered me from when I'd found our wedding ring there, and he agreed to hold it for 3 more months if I could pay $20 a week toward buying it back. It wasn't much, but getting that ring back felt like reclaiming something important, even if the marriage it represented was destroyed, because at least I'd have proof that something real had existed before all the lies. The prosecutor called on a Monday morning saying Ursula wanted to take a plea deal at the last minute, agreeing to plead guilty to all charges in exchange for 5 years with possibility of parole in 2. The restitution order would be for the full $400,000 plus damages and court costs, bringing it close to $500,000 that she'd be paying back for the rest of her life. They needed my input, but honestly I just wanted it over so Tommy could start healing without a trial hanging over us, and 5 years seemed like enough time for him to grow up without her influence. I signed the papers agreeing to the deal that afternoon and watched Tommy carefully when I told him his mom would be gone for a while. He sat on the couch picking at a loose thread on his shirt and asked if jail would make her better like how the hospital made his friend's grandpa better after his heart attack. I said I hoped so, and he nodded like he understood more than any 6-year-old should have to understand about broken adults. The next few weeks brought endless paperwork as the financial advisor helped me dispute every fraudulent account Ursula had opened in my name. Each credit bureau required different forms and proof that I'd been deployed when the accounts were opened, and the advisor warned me it would take 3 to 5 years before my credit fully recovered. Stephen came by most Wednesdays to pick up Tommy for dinner, and I watched them through the window as Tommy showed him his new baseball cards in the driveway. We weren't friends exactly, but we'd text about Tommy's school stuff, or when he needed his inhaler refilled, and sometimes we'd grab a beer while Tommy played at the park. One Saturday, Tommy slipped and called him Uncle Steve instead of just Stephen, then looked at me worried like he'd done something wrong. Stephen froze too, but I just shrugged and said, Uncle Steve sounded right since that's basically what he'd become anyway. Tommy smiled and went back to building his Lego set, while Stephen and I pretended we weren't both a little emotional about it. By February, 6 months after I'd first walked through that door, we'd found our rhythm with Tommy in therapy twice a week, me working full-time at the base and Stephen taking him to soccer practice on Saturdays. The house felt different without the constant crisis, but Tommy was doing his homework without fights and actually laughing at cartoons again. The insurance company sent letters every month about Ursula's restitution payments, which started at $50 monthly from her prison job. The investigator said they'd garnish her wages forever once she got out, but warned me most victims never see more than 10% of what they're owed. I filed the letters in a folder and tried not to think about the money we'd never get back. That March, I realized Tommy had slept through the whole week without waking up screaming about coffins or asking if I was really there. 7 straight nights of him just being a regular kid who slept until his alarm went off for school felt like winning the lottery. I marked it on the calendar with a little star and noticed the stars were starting to add up to more good weeks than bad ones. One night after Tommy was asleep, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote a letter to Martinez, my friend who'd pushed me down when the shooting started and took 3 bullets that should have been mine. I told him about Tommy getting better, about having a steady paycheck again, about Stephen becoming this weird kind of family we'd never planned for. I wrote that the life he'd saved by dying was used to give my son stability and safety and a chance at normal. I sealed the letter and drove to the cemetery the next morning before work to leave it on his headstone with the others from his unit. Standing there, I realized that even though nothing had turned out how I'd expected when I'd gotten on that plane home, we were actually doing okay most days now. Well, that's the finale no one was holding their breath for. If you made it all the way through, I guess you've already proven you've got patience for nonsense. Might as well hit subscribe and commit to it fully. At least then it's consistent.